Welcome back.
Welcome to Decision Space, the only show to take place right here in the space between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Jake Friedman.
And I'm Brendan Hansen.
And this is the podcast about decisions in games.
And in today's episode, we're taking more of a mechanical focus. We're going to talk about sweet spot mechanisms in games. Or maybe you might think of these as a Goldilocks zone, where there's a mechanic within the game where too little is not enough, too much is too much, so you want it just right. So we have a list of examples we'll go through, we'll kind of talk about where we jumped off and got the idea for this episode, and then talk about how this affects the types of decisions you're making, and what you're thinking about in the game in which a mechanism like a sweet spot is added, and how that affects sort of the feel of the game and the play experience.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit more of a teaser to the front, I think there are elements where it makes sense to call something a sweet spot mechanic, but also I think this phenomenon of the Goldilocks zone or whatever is just something that's incredibly core to play in all varieties. I mean, I think it's almost something quintessential to how we play as people. And of course, when we talk about board games on this show, that's just, a small subsection of play. But I think this is something that also people will, relate to it more as we bring in more examples from perhaps outside of exclusively board games, like video games or sports and things like that. So it's going to be a classic decision space where we talk about the decisions in all games, but mainly focusing on board games, of course. But before we get into that conversation, I just want to make a really quick appeal for ratings for this show. We always ask for people to make reviews, but it's also really cool if you just click 5-star rating. And the reason I ask is because we're at 99 ratings on Apple Podcasts, I just happened to see. And it's been kind of stuck there for a few weeks. I'm just keep looking at it, waiting for that to roll over to 100. So I would like to invite you, listener, please be our 100th rater on Apple Podcasts. You can also rate us on Spotify. You can probably rate us inside the podcast aggregating app where you're listening to this. And that would mean a lot to us as we continue to work hard to make this show almost each and every week.
So let's get into it. I mentioned that we'd start with the jumping off point for this episode, and I am a subscriber to GameTek, a newsletter by Jeff Engelstein that you can subscribe to using a link in the show notes. Jeff Engelstein, in his GameTek newsletter, has an article called The Goldilocks Zone, Building in a Sweet Spot from July 23rd of this year. I saw this article and just found it really a succinct summary of this whole idea. And I love Jeff's work. He has a book on mechanisms in games. He was one of the original co-hosts of the podcast Ludology, and I think he's just generally a great thinker on games. So I read this and I thought, Jake, we could have a great conversation about this mechanism tied to decisions. So that's what we're doing. So as sort of do you have anything to add, Jake, before I kind of read some of Jeff's initial thoughts as a way of generating some conversation here?
Well, I was curious when you said you can subscribe. So I just went ahead and clicked subscribe to the GameTek blog or Substack right now. And it does have options for paying money. If you'd like to support GameTek, please do so. But you could also subscribe for free to check out some of the content like I just did just now. So in case that wasn't clear to people, I want to clarify that you could take a look at this article that we're going to be talking about for free. And again, there's a link in the description of this very podcast.
Yeah.
Brendan, take it away.
So I'm going to read the intro because I think it's a really concise way of kicking off this whole conversation, Jake. Interrupt me if I go long. In most games, doing more of something is better. Getting all the territories, harvesting all the resources, or catching all the criminals is better than getting not as many territories, resources, or criminals. Same with avoiding bad things. If you can take 0 damage, that's better than taking 2. But there are some games that have a twist on this. Getting more of something is good, but only up to a point. Once you go above a certain value, it turns against you and is bad. I call this a sweet spot mechanism. And that's I as in Jeff Engelstein. So yeah, that's where we're going to kick off this whole conversation.
Yeah, I think it's a really concise explainer for what we're talking about here. But I want to really quickly maybe start with this question. which is when you think of Euro games as a whole, it feels like you could almost make the case for a sweet spot existing in almost any mechanism. And by that, I mean, if you're playing an efficiency game, right, you want to
Yeah.
do just enough to maximize the points per your actions in maybe different avenues in this space, but almost always going like too far in one direction is going to set you back in the game just from pure efficiency of like I've already pushed to the end of this track, right? So now I must stop going down that track and I will be, more efficient to do something else. But that's not really a sweet spot. Am I making myself clear?
Well, yeah, you definitely are. I think that in some ways you just gave two examples, and I think they're
Yeah.
slightly different. So one of the examples you gave is I got to the end of this track and I should do something else, right? So something that comes to mind is maybe like the search for Planet X. No, not the search for Planet X. Planet Unknown, the polyomino game that we
Yeah.
covered on the
Yeah. That's a
show,
great example of
with
this.
tracks going up, you can get to the end of a track and still do the actions that would move you up on that track, but go no further. In some ways, I think that is sort of on the spectrum of if this is a sweet spot or not, more of a sweet spot than just a pure efficiency puzzle, which I'll talk about in a second, because the penalty for getting to the top of a track in Planet Unknown and still doing that thing is you just get zero, you get nothing, right?
Yeah.
There's a punitive aspect to that. Juxtaposed with, or by comparison, let's say there's a game where you're trying to collect goods and fulfill contracts, but at the end of the game, you're going to score all those goods anyway. So maybe it won't be quite as efficient if you don't turn those goods in, but you're still going to get 1 point for every good that you get. And maybe if you turn them into a contract, you'll get 2 points for each of those goods instead. I think that the core idea here of a sweet spot in my mind, and what takes you from sort of this is just an efficiency puzzle to this is a sweet spot mechanism, is there's some form of penalty. So it's
Yes.
more punitive if you don't get any benefit at all for doing the same thing again. But I agree, it doesn't really feel like a sweet spot if it's just sort of you don't get any benefit. You almost need to get punished for it in some way, shape, or form.
I agree completely. That is
Okay.
my argument for what makes sense if we're here like, naming a new mechanism, right? That or maybe something to list on the Board Game Geek page for
Mm,
blackjack, right? Would be sweet spot mechanic, or something like that
yep.
versus just your classic Euro efficiency puzzle. And I think I'll just bring us back to Planet Unknown for one more example because to me it makes it really clear. On those tracks, right? When you go up so far, you're unlocking a new point threshold, right? You
Mm,
you go up halfway and you get 3 points. If you go up four, three more spaces, now you'll get 4 points for that track. So if you go up, you hit the 3 point threshold and move 2 more spaces higher, you still get 3 points and get no reward for that, right? So to play it maximally efficiently, you want to land on exactly the scoring markers and no higher. But
yeah.
that's not really a sweet spot. That's just an efficiency puzzle.
Yep. And with all board game mechanisms, I think that there's sort of these sorts of things can exist on a spectrum, right? Where the further you go, the more punitive, the more it's going to feel like this thing, right? If there's
Hmm.
this really narrow window and there's a huge benefit within that narrow window and there's a huge penalty, it's going to feel a lot like a sweet spot. And if you minimize the negative penalty and you minimize the benefit in some way, if it's a smoother sort of payoff curve and the drop off is less, it might feel a little bit less like a sweet spot, but still give you some of that feelings. And I think that it's important to think of that as a knob. It's kind of like all the different variations of worker placement where, okay, maybe this feels like more of whatever I think worker placement is in a conversation like that. Oh no, I've brought us to defining worker placements in this episode.
Yeah.
We need to run away quick. But why
Well,
don't we pivot to
wait, wait,
blackjack?
wait, 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 wait.
No.
Because I'm not defining worker placement. I'm just saying to illustrate your point, the point that
Yeah.
you're making
Okay.
in the context of Planet Unknown, a game we're already talking about. There's
Great.
maybe 3 roughly blank spaces before you hit the next scoring marker on a
Mm,
track. If there
yeah.
were 500, getting to the 3.1 and then moving 499 additional spaces,
Yeah.
but falling one short of getting a 4th point, that is going to feel worse than just going a single spot above it, right? So it'll
Totally.
feel worse to you. However, in my mind, it still doesn't make sense to call that a sweet spot, right? That's just like performing very poorly at the efficiency puzzle in a game, and some games will allow you to perform more poorly than other games because of the way they're using those knobs. But if you're
Yeah.
not getting dinged for it, to me, it doesn't make sense to, claim it's related for sure, but probably not the sweet spot as I think we should be talking about it in this podcast.
Totally. And I think maybe now is a good point to make this point, which is that there's lots of ways in which games in general, the broad games like sports and dexterity games and board games and video games can put a sweet spot mechanism into their games, right? There's just my ability to actually execute on some activity that has a sweet spot. So something that comes to mind of like, when you play Mario Golf or any game with a meter going across and you're trying to stop it and in this exact spot. And if you do, you get this nice benefit. But maybe if you go too far, you whiff. That's a sweet spot mechanism, right? And that has to do with, can I time it right? Am I looking and am I physically able to stop this at exactly the right time? And then you could do the same thing in board games. They're really good at exploring efficiencies and decision making.
Well, how about Crokinole, a dexterity game that has almost the exact same mechanism where you
Sure.
want to hit it just hard enough to get it within the central circle so that you can score. Basically, you get to leave your uh, puck or whatever you call it on the board if it stops within that center circle. But if it goes out of the center circle because you've hit it too hard or you don't hit it hard enough and it doesn't enter the center circle, it comes off the board.
Yeah.
That's very punishing. So that's a very and you'll find this all over the world of dexterity games and sports, right? The most sports that we play are fundamentally built upon different sweet spot mechanics, but it's like the dexterity game element where it's asking you to throw the ball with just enough force that it will go over the rim and into the basket and not so much force that it goes over the backboard or falls short of the rim, right? You, I think to me, that's an
Yep.
example of, the sweet spot mechanic where, do the benefit, scoring points, the penalty, turning over the ball, very clear. Um, and that's
What
what makes sports, I think, so fun and so tense because there's constantly this kind of push and pull, risk versus reward, making very specific demands on your body as the playing piece and how you're, manipulating the object around the field.
Okay, so I have a question for you, Jake. And we have to talk about board games because we're talking way too much about physical
No, I
games
said I
for our
said
show.
crokinole.
Yes, no, yeah, right. Okay. Darts. Okay.
Yes.
Literally in the center, there is a sweet spot, a bullseye that gives you the most points on the whole board, right? But
Mhm.
if you miss that sweet spot, we've talked about how you need some sort of punitive outcome. So does darts count as having a sweet spot mechanism? In my mind, it almost has to, right? It's like
It
literally a bullseye. It's a sweet
yeah,
spot that you're aiming for. But miss it. What's the penalty for missing? I guess you miss the board and you get 0 points.
right. I mean, I think like that is kind of like the efficiency piece, right?
Sure.
Where you could potentially make the argument like this is actually kind of an efficiency puzzle. However,
Yeah.
I'm not an expert at Dart, so there may be different variants
Scoring news. Yeah.
and how it works. How I've played before in bars is I think I think it's 501 where you have to get 501
Yeah.
points. And if you go over, then you lose out on that whole last round. It's like a little bust mechanic at the end of the game that
Yeah.
does make it a sweet spot. Like I have to hit exactly the 13 to clear out. If I hit the 20, oops, now I have to I don't get any points for that whole last round.
Okay, perfect. You said the word bust, which is
Yeah.
bringing us back into board game land.
Okay,
Takes us to
okay.
blackjack.
Board games
What
for the rest, except for maybe
we
at the very end.
yeah. Except for yeah. Stay for the fun stuff after dark, but not that type of after dark. Just like other types of games in the dark. But Jake, oh no, will you talk to us about blackjack? Because I think this is one of the best examples of a sweet spot mechanism in games.
Right. Yeah.
This is like
Such a
foundational example.
foundational. Everybody's familiar with blackjack. It's a push your luck card game where a dealer will be flipping cards up for you off the top of the deck. Your goal is to get as close to 21 as possible without going over. If you go over 21, then you automatically lose the game. You've busted. I'm explaining how to play blackjack here. But it's a risk versus reward thing, because if you stop short, you can stop at any time. Say I stop at 16. Now the dealer will kind of resolve their own hand following a set protocol of when they have to hit or not. And if they bust, or stop short of you or whatever, I guess they never stop short of you. That's probably how it works. If they bust, then you win. So there's push and pull.
I think it's cool because it's a game where the sweet spot is 21, right? If you get to 21, you just win the hand. So that's the sweetest of sweet spots. But 20 still is, yeah, nothing will beat you. I mean, I think there's rules about the type of jack you use to like complicate the rules slightly.
I don't know. Yeah.
Using the okay, but anyway, it's cool because right, if you get to 20, that's still a pretty good place to be. Right, 16, there's nice decision making there. But do you think so? A similar sort of push your luck game that came to mind immediately for me that I think is a good example for illustrating this lens in some ways. But I'm curious about your take on it. What do you think of Can't Stop? How does Can't Stop fit into the Goldilocks zone / sweet spots?
Yeah, I was literally going to ask you this same question.
It's a tricky pickle.
It's a tough one, yeah. So Can't Stop, you're rolling dice, moving pegs up tracks.
Yeah.
And you can keep rolling until you bust. And if you bust, you lose all progress for that round. And a bust in this case is you're unable to make progress on any of the 3 tracks that you're moving up that turn. So if you move up one spot, you're probably just going to roll again because you're not really losing out on that much. But once you've hit a couple of good rolls and you've moved up 3 or 4 spots, all of a sudden the opportunity cost of rolling again increases. You may choose to stop or you keep going. You could lose all your progress. So is this a sweet spot? I kind of feel like not, if only because there is no clear sweet spot. So maybe that's like what do you think? Do you agree?
That's kind of where my brain went. And you could argue, someone who's listening might say, Jake, like, oh, there's a sweet spot. Finishing one of the tracks is a sweet spot. Yeah, kind of. But I think that
but even then, finishing 2 tracks is much superior.
Sweeter. Yeah. So I think that you're right. That part of the feel of this mechanism, I think Can't Stop is definitely on the spectrum, right? Because you have this big penalty and you have something you're aiming for, but you're going to feel a sweet spot mechanism more when you know exactly what you're aiming for. And I think Jeff calling it this a sweet spot mechanism helps illustrate this because you know what the spot is, right? It's more fun in some ways, or it emphasizes all of the feelings that come along with this mechanism when you know what you're aiming for. So it reminds me of things like trick-taking games where you're bidding. You're sort of saying, the sweet spot for my hand, looking at my hand of cards, is this. I'll be aiming for this round. And typically there's a big penalty for going over or under that number in terms of points for a trick-taking game. So I think that's an important distinction here. You want to know what the spot is and have an understanding of the penalty. And that's going to emphasize how sweet spotty your sweet spot mechanism is.
Yeah. The more clear, what you're going for, probably the more pronounced this mechanism is on the decision space, right? And when you think of some of the other examples, crokinole, right? You've got a literal bullseye, right? Darts, you've got a literal bullseye. The best case is so clear that you can't really ignore it. Where Can't Stop falls down a little bit is that people could debate, right, on where's the appropriate place to stop. Since we mentioned trick-taking games, another question I have about this, something to think about, is like, is it possible that you could have 2 sweet spots, maybe even 2 competing sweet spots? So listed in the article, Jeff mentions hearts, which has a shooting the moon mechanism. In hearts, you're trying to not take tricks. However, if you take all the tricks in the round, then that's kind of a sweet spot. Instead of taking 15 points or whatever it is, everybody else gets points except for you. So hearts almost has 2 sweet spots, kind of, right? Where like taking 0 tricks, as long as nobody else takes all the tricks, is a sweet spot. But also shooting the moon is like a super sweet spot. It's like a jackpot almost.
Definitely. And I think that is totally possible. I think a game can have mini sweet spots and still have sweet spot mechanisms. So another example that Jeff mentioned, it's actually the game that came to mind immediately for me, because it might be the game I've talked about most on this podcast, if not for something like Tigers and Euphrates. But it's The Fox and the Forest, a 2-player trick-taking game that's just purely distilled brilliant design. And The Fox and the Forest is a game in which you are dealt a hand of cards, just like a normal trick-taking game. 13 cards to be exact, out of a sort of pool of cards where some are unknown. And you have to make a decision, but you don't have to declare the decision, that you're either going to try to win tricks or lose tricks this round against your opponent. So you're thinking about, do I think my hand is probably stronger than my opponent's hand this round, or probably weaker? And how much stronger or weaker than it is? Unlike most trick-taking games, you don't start the round by saying, I'm going to lose tricks this round, or I'm going to win 7 tricks this round. You just go off feeling. Because in The Fox and the Forest, you're trying to get to 21 points, and you're going to win points for how a given round of tricks goes. So if you can win between 0 and 3 tricks, so lose most of the tricks, right? There's 13 total. That's a sweet spot. The game calls you humble, and it gives you 6 points. If you can win between 7 and 9 points, again, this is zero sum, right? So it's impossible for one player to win 3 and another player to win 7, because there's 13 total. So if someone wins between 7 and 9, that means that they have hit a different sweet spot in terms of winning tricks, and they're victorious. They get 6 points. But if someone wins between 10 and 13 points, they get 0 points. And then winning sort of between the two sweet spots, you're going to get a nominal amount of points, 1, 2, or 3. So there's these 2 true sweet spots, and it's really a who's more right, the person who thought they were going to lose more tricks, or the person who thought they could hit that sweet spot just perfectly and kind of push the person trying to lose tricks just over their sweet spot so they win 4 or 5.
Yeah, and the fact that the game, right, those 2 sweet spots are entangled and also kind of opaque between players just leads to so much fun decision space, right? Where so much of the game is it's as much playing your it's the type of game where it's as much playing your opponent as you're playing your hand,
Yeah.
because you're as you play cards, you're trying to figure out which sweet spot your opponent is going for, and the quicker you're able to identify that, the better you'll be able to force them over or under what they're going for, so that perhaps, you can hit your sweet spot instead, or at least get that nominal edge over your opponent.
Yeah. I think for me, Jake, the Fox and the Forest example also illustrates a really cool aspect of having a sweet spot mechanism. And that's that you're not always going to hit the sweet spot, right? So when you hit it, it feels a little bit like an event. And in some games, say the Fox and the Forest, oftentimes, I can't remember if this math works out perfectly, but like basically it's going to happen fairly often because the players are
Yeah.
aiming for it. But it still feels really good. If you manage to be humble and only win between 0 and 3 tricks, you feel like you've accomplished something by hitting that sweet spot, because it was a goal, something you were aiming for that you then made happen. I think in the same way, the furthest end of the spectrum here is maybe you think of like classic arcades when you were a kid, and there's the game that's a ticket game. It's not like a regular game that just has lights in a ring,
Oh,
and you're
yeah,
trying
I
to
used to
stop it.
love that. It's just like
Yeah.
pure
So what are you
reaction
doing?
time.
Yeah. The light goes
So,
around in the ring, and you just
yeah,
hit a
you just
button,
literally press the button at the
try
right
to get it
time
to
and
stop at the sweet spot. And that's really hard to do, that timing. It's just like the Mario Golf example, right? You're trying to stop with little light in the right spot. But when you make that happen, because it's so difficult, it feels really exciting. And I think the sweet spot mechanisms are about anticipation, right? Giving you a goal, making that goal difficult to reach, structuring the game in pursuit of that goal, and then allowing you to achieve it sometimes. And that creates this moment of potentially intense excitement. Or when you fail and you get the penalty, kind of potentially a sort of painful moment or a funny moment, maybe if you're not the player who's failing.
yeah, it's I'm reflecting on this and realizing that it's definitely closely related to efficiency on one side, but it's also closely related to jackpots. Something
Yeah.
else we've
Yeah.
talked about on this podcast, a mechanism where, all the lights line up just right and the game pays you off handsomely. Sometimes these might even be one and the same, right? Where if a game sets up the incentives just right with a jackpot mechanism, you hitting that can also be a sort of jackpot moment in the game where your brain gets a nice kick of endorphins. You see all the Tetris rows clearing at once as you drop your perfect block shape and reap the reward.
Yeah, totally. Mentioning that it can feel like a jackpot brought Alhambra to mind for me, Jake. Alhambra is a 2003 tile laying game that's sort of this classic Spiel des Jahres winner that I've played a little bit. I haven't played it a ton. But the mechanic that came to mind for sweet spots is in Alhambra, the sort of atom, the core loop of the game is collect money, use that money to buy tiles, build out your Alhambra by putting those tiles next to each other. But the fun wrinkle here is when you collect money, it only comes in set denominations. And when you buy tiles, if you can pay with exact change, you just get a bonus turn. Just go again. So Alhambra, in some ways, is structured around the sweet spot of paying exact change. And if you do this right, you can set up turns where you can pay the exact change multiple times and take multiple extra turns. And I think that it just feels really cool. That's more towards the efficiency side of things, right? Where the downside of not paying exact change is you lose the whatever buying power you had, not paying the exact change. So you sort of lose the efficiency on that side. But the upside for hitting the sweet spot is dramatic enough that to me it feels like a sweet spot mechanism because taking another turn, that bonus feels really good. I think this is sort of another cool classic example of a nice little Eurofied sweet spot mechanism.
Another example of a sweet spot mechanism, maybe. I need your
Okay.
opinion on this. You be the judge. Are blind bid auctions inherently
Oh, I
sweet
was wondering about
spots?
this today. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Okay, so this is a really interesting question. So by blind bid, you mean there's something out on the table, we're all going to put some amount of our currency in our hand, reveal it at the same time. Whoever bids the highest wins the thing.
And
So you're
generally, in these games, whoever loses the bid gets to have their money back, but
back.
sometimes not. There
Yeah.
are examples of games where you put in whatever you're planning to spend, and winner gets a benefit. Maybe there's some type of tiered reward for second, third, fourth, etc., and everybody just loses all the money that was put in there.
So I think my answer to this would be based on the conversation we've had, right? Is if a spot mechanism is an objective that gives you some benefit, a nice meaty benefit, usually like a big bonus, and then if missing it is a penalty, you're lacking in a blind bid, simultaneously blind bid, the objective that you're shooting for outside of the number you're all holding in your head. So you don't get the sensation of, I want to go for this. You just get the sensation of, what do I think is the sweet spot at this
Yeah, but
table?
it's not known, but there is a sweet spot, which would be bidding, assuming you want to win
One
one
more than
value
whoever.
higher than
Yeah.
second highest bid.
Right. So I think it is almost there and
It's
gives you
it's
some of the same feel.
it's
What do you think?
interesting because, well, there is no penalty on the high end. It
If you
just
keep your money.
Well, on the high end, there's an efficiency thing, right?
Oh,
The
sure, sure,
punishment
sure.
for missing the sweet spot high is however much extra you bid. Could feel
Sure,
worse and worse and worse, but that's not actually like the game is like you lose 5 points because you bid. Unless the game said that, right? You lose five
sure,
points if you bid five higher than the second highest bid or more. So it could
sure.
have it, but I don't know of any games that have that exact type of mechanism.
Yeah.
It does if it is this like sunk cost type of blind bid auction where everybody just loses it, then there is a punishment in my mind on the short end, right? I bid 3 thinking I would win, but I didn't win and I just lost 3 and got
Yeah.
nothing out of it.
Yeah.
This is a mechanism that does exist in games, but I'm having a hard time thinking of. I think maybe this element appears in a slightly less punitive way in Beowulf the Legend. I could be
Mm,
getting that wrong, but there are games out there. I promise you this. People will
yeah.
tell us in our Discord conversation about this episode after we release it.
Awesome. Okay, here's a question. Captain Flip, game that won the Spiel des Jahres this year, we both really enjoy, have played it a ton, has this mechanism that people often talk about when they talk about Captain Flip, which is that Captain Flip's a game where you're adding tiles of all these different pirates to your board that all have different scoring conditions. The tiles that are the most efficient, so the tiles that I want to get typically, usually, are gunners. They pay 5 points when you place them on your board, which is the most any one tile plays will give you without sort of special setup to make that not true. You have to, it doesn't take any effort. So if you get one gunner, 5 points. If you get two gunners, 5 points, another five. If you get three gunners,
So 10 points,
10 points to combine. If you get three and you still
15.
have three showing at the end of your game, 15 points, but actually you lose
But
the game. Because if you have three
oh,
gunners showing at the end, you just lose. And you can flip these tiles once they're played to your board using other tiles that allow you to flip them. Is this a sweet spot mechanism? I don't think so. It doesn't feel like it to me.
yeah, it feels a bit different. I mean, so it's kind of the inverse of the blind
Yeah.
bid auction, where it's punishment on the high end, but no punishment on the short end.
Yeah.
Which I think, right, as we're kind of talking through this, I think I feel like we're picking up some different factors that make a game more or less sweet spotty, right? We start out with, thinking about that it has to have a clear sweet spot, right? There has to
Yeah.
be a punishment on either end. So I feel like in both these cases, they're close to it, they're approaching that, but it misses out because it's not a sweet spot. It's like a hard limit here.
Totally. So
Don't walk past that line.
so if you
Don't
twisted
cross this
it,
line.
yeah,
A
it's a
line in the
threshold.
sand mechanic.
Totally. A lot, yeah, great. Even more evocative. But if you twisted it as a thought experiment and said, okay, if you zero, one, or two gunners is 0 points. Three gunners is 20 points. Four
Right.
gunners, you lose the game. Boom. We have a sweet spot mechanism. Right?
That feels very different, I think,
Yep.
than the mechanisms we have now. How about this one? I came up with another example. I got Rhino Kniz on the mind, Rhino
Great.
Knizia. What about High Society?
Okay.
So that's a game, an auction game with the classic Knizia twist on it, where you win the game if you have the most points, unless you have the least amount of money at the end of the game.
Okay. So this is the same as
It's like,
this
is the
is
whole game a sweet spot?
that is the whole game a sweet spot. This is the
Yeah.
same as the blind bet auction, but the whole game is blind.
Yeah. I guess it
Yeah, yeah.
doesn't. Well, it does have. Yeah, it doesn't have really a punishment on the short end either, but kind
I
of
think
does
that
if your goal is to, like, if the punishment is you lose because you missed it on the short end, you didn't spend enough money, and you don't have enough points.
Yeah. I think that it's testing the exact same skills that sort of in a blind efficiency sweet spot mechanism would, but it feels weird to me. Not knowing what the sweet spot is feels different than when you know, right? So when we're
Hmm.
all trying to guess what the sweet spot is and that's happening in real time, and I don't know what it is, or even if I haven't said it, right? Like at least in trick taking games, you like call your shot by bidding, and that's your sweet spot. But here, you're just kind of all thinking about it and constantly adjusting. I think that just evokes something similar that's not quite. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you might be right. It feels different to me than just a blind bid auction
Yeah,
in some ways. It's almost like this might just be stupid. I might be stupid here, but it almost feels like
it's a safe
we
space
have we have sweet spot mechanisms. High society feels like a sweet spot decision
game.
space.
Oh, interesting.
Like,
Okay.
that's the decision space you're operating in, is constantly judging
Yeah,
both ends and trying to shoot the middle
yeah.
with all your actions in the game.
I totally see what you're saying. And you have these two levers, right? Your pursuit of points and your spending of money, and you're trying to line them up perfectly
I'm
to
just
move down the
picturing,
tracks the
like,
right amount.
playing high society as a crane operator. You just got, like, these pulley things.
Yeah, that's I think that's a really great way of looking at it, Jake, that you're going to get a lot of the same feelings of having one of these mechanisms. Because I will say, we've talked about the sensation of hitting a sweet spot perfectly when it's a pretty unlikely one. And I will say the reveal at the end of a game of high society, in the way that hitting a jackpot is an event that everyone at the table can at least emotionally experience empathetically for you if they're not excited it's happening to them. In high society, you know who has the most points, but then when you do the reveal of who's spent the most money, that's typically a really exciting moment in the same way. And I think what we're learning is that games that are purely about efficiency could benefit, but if they don't have exciting dramatic moments, could benefit from adding a sweet spot moment, because it gives you the potential for an event that everyone can come together in the game and sort of say, oh, cool, let me talk about this sweet spot moment that happens.
I just thought of like a cool idea for like a party game or something, Brendan. Tell
Okay,
me if this
cool.
has legs, okay? It's like
Okay,
a social deduction style game, like where words or something,
okay,
but it's like there's a hidden sweet spot. The sweet spot is hidden. There is a sweet spot that is secret to everybody
yeah.
except for the person who's like the traitor.
Okay, that sounds really cool. I can't. Are you pitching me wavelength?
It feels like wavelength, but in like a like where words meets wavelength. I think
Interesting. I think
it's
that could be
kind of thing.
cool. That
Yeah, I
could be
don't know.
cool.
It's
Re-
I don't know. It's just
I'm
something.
definitely
The reason
following.
I was thinking about it is, I mean, I don't. There's no more where that came from. That's the extent of the idea. But I think there's something really interesting about this idea of sweet spots are really exciting when they're known, but
Yeah,
also like it's just funny to me and interesting if there is an exact predetermined sweet spot in a game, but
yeah,
it's a secret. Like
yeah.
I think there could be something cool with that.
I think there's great room for comedy there too, where there has to be a funnier setup. But I'm just imagining, a book about a delivery like someone has too much stuff delivered to their house all at once, right? Like you wanted some of the stuff, but did you want six refrigerators? And like
Right,
I
like
don't
the
know.
yeah, totally,
Yeah, yeah,
totally. Where everybody's like revealing, I don't know, maybe it's like a number thing, right? Like how
totally.
high can you get to the close to the sweet spot number? And
Right.
everybody's in like the tens, and one person's like 6,000.
Yeah. I want, yeah, because the whole thing about a sweet spot, right, is this idea of like some of a good thing is good, but too much of a good thing can be bad. So if the game
Yeah,
structure around that, I totally think it would work, and
maybe
it
there's
gives
a little
you,
QE in this game too.
yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. Okay. All right. We're on to
So
something.
definitely, that's we'll talk offline out of the interstitial ship. Another game
Yeah,
that I
we
think
can't
does
let anybody else into an idea this good.
this good, right? Exactly.
That's why. That's why
Yeah,
Brendan's
yeah,
moving me on because he thinks the
yeah.
idea is just so good. Not
It's
that
so
he wants to
good.
move me on to progress the show into more interesting territory.
Well,
Thanks,
I just
buddy. That means a lot.
no, it was so good. We got to shut it down. I want to take you into Colorado land because I think that is just somewhere where we love to exist too. Colorado, a
Yeah.
game designed around sweet spots, or no?
Like, well,
Okay,
it feels different, right? It is not the 21 of sweet spots where you
no.
just have a clear thing. So let's try and add some of our criteria. Are there punishments on either end?
Okay,
So,
yes, but not in the way you
so we should
think.
probably say, what will you explain how Colorado
Okay,
works? We're
yeah.
talking particularly about the scoring mechanism.
Colorado is a set collection game in which you're collecting sets of differently colored cards, and there is triangular scoring. So the more cards of a color you get, the more points you get at the end of the game. You're collecting the cards by you flip cards up, and you can sort of choose the rows that they go in, or you can pick a row that's already out, and you do that sort of round after round. But the penalty comes in with, if you have a lot of cards of one color, great, you're going to get a lot of points. A lot of cards of two colors, two different colors, great, you're going to get a lot of points. Three colors, great, you're going to get a lot of points. But the fourth color, if you get a lot of cards of four colors, you're going to lose points, and it hurts. What do you think?
Yeah, right. So you it has like a quasi bust thing where
Yeah,
you want a perfect round, right? Is getting as six blue cards, six yellow cards, six green cards, and nothing else.
nothing else. Yep.
Right. That is the sweet spot. Going over it, it gets progressively more punishing the more of other cards you get.
Yeah.
Going under it, you lose out on point potential. Is that what you're
Yeah.
talking about?
Yeah.
How do you what were you
I think that I bring it up because I think this is a good example of sort of saying Colorado exists on this spectrum of sweet spots, right? Where it has just a dash of it. So it gives you something to aim for and it does have the penalty, but it doesn't exactly have this like bonkers benefit for accomplishing what you're aiming for. Because what you're aiming for is a lot of cards of three colors, and it's not that hard to get, three colors. And the penalty for getting more than too many of a fourth color, it's not so bad.
well, it
So
starts really small, like getting a
yeah,
single card in three other colors. You have six colors, but three of them you only have one card in. That's
yeah,
only minus 3 points. So it really starts getting bad once you're getting two, three, four of the same color that is not your top color.
So it's not really a sweet spot game, but more of like a sweet area game.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. Nah.
It can also, I mean, one of the things about Colorado that makes it feel a little more sweet spotty is that you don't always have complete agency over what you take, right? So you could say like, I don't want to have to have more colors, right?
Sure.
Like
Yeah.
I'm going for less, but like you're forced to take a row at the end of the round.
Yeah.
And it might like ham fist you into doing more than you want, meaning you're being punished from like earlier rounds when you perhaps like didn't drop out early or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it definitely has an element of it for sure. I would agree with that. But yeah, it's like it's another one of these sort of like semi or quasi cases of it.
Is another example of that Azul? So in Azul, you're collecting tiles. You have these rows that you're putting the tiles in before you can add them to your board. The rows have certain numbers of tiles you have to fill up to get to add one tile of that type to your board, where you're ultimately trying to get them to score points. So if you take 4 blue tiles, but you only have a spot where you can add uh, blue tiles to sort of tee them up to go onto your board. 2 more of them drop down to the bottom, and you're going to get
Eh,
negative points for those tiles. What do you think? Are
I
we in
feel
the
like
realm here?
I think that is further away. Like we're getting
Okay.
colder. To me,
We're getting
that
colder.
feels
Yeah.
like pretty clearly a
Efficiency.
efficiency puzzle
Yeah.
type of thing. It does have like times where people can bust big time when you're
Real bad.
first to like forced to
Yeah.
take a bunch of stuff that goes straight to your factory floor. But that still feels almost more like you've like poorly navigated the draft phase or just got totally screwed and it was kind of like inevitably you were going to be forced to take it.
And I think part of that too is there's no bonus really for laying down 5
Other than
tiles in
just
the 5 row.
efficiency, yeah.
Yeah. Like if you drafted 5 and put them in the 5 row and got another turn, I think that's going to feel more like a sweet spot mechanism, right? Like all of a sudden if there's something to aim for, like going for the exact change in Alhambra, right? We're back to that like I have a goal. I'm going
Yeah.
for this.
Right.
Um
Let's just remind folks some of the like ones that were really crystal clear to us
yep.
are it felt like a lot of times these trick taking games where you're calling your shot, right? I'm going to try and win exactly 3 tricks this round.
Yep.
Kosu Dice is a game that I talk about a lot on this podcast. It's my favorite trick taking game. That has this sweet spot element where you're kind of building your own sweet spot over the course of the hand. And then did you hit it? If you did, great. You reap a lot of rewards. If not, 0 points.
Yep.
Or not 0 points, but you get like however many tricks you won.
Yep.
And then we also talked about blackjack, so there are examples of this mostly in card games. I think maybe it works a little better. I'm realizing we're seeing it appear more commonly in card games that are like very quick iterative rounds because I think a long form hour long board game like built around a sweet spot with like very clear boundaries of like, did you do this? Great, you get a big rewards. If not, if you missed it, you get punished. Would feel kind of like unsatisfying, I guess, because it feels like it'd be tough to create a game that has that in like multiple instances,
Yeah.
uh where it's going to like remain fun for all the players. It might
Like
feel like like you're
if
just out of it if you get punished and somebody else gets
yeah.
all the rewards in the first third of the game.
If the end game scoring of say broom service had a sweet spot if you're trying to deliver exactly this amount or something.
Yeah, it might be okay if it's like closer to the high society example, where you're trying to, shape, like all the decisions over the course of the game are like sort of shaping towards like a sweet
Mm,
spot final scoring phase.
yeah.
But I think you wouldn't want to have like, I don't know, like a more complicated blackjack, right? Like a blackjack, maybe it could exist, but like a blackjack driven engine building game, um, that might feel bad if you bust in the first round and somebody else hits
Sure.
blackjack and then like ramps
Spirals
up
out
their
of
engine.
control.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Which makes me, as we're talking through this, Jake, something that's coming to mind for me is I think that these mechanisms tend to benefit from players having fairly high agency over what they're doing, right? Like part of the reason sweet spots are fun is that if I play the game more, I'm going to get better at landing in the sweet spot.
Yeah.
And I want to play because I want to experience that fun thing more regularly and show others that I can do that more regularly. So I could see a game where, say, like it's a Euro game where round to round at the beginning, you're going to say how much you're going to produce of a certain thing. And if you make too much, then you get penalized. And if you make too little, you don't get as much of a benefit. So, but that's just the bidding of trick taking games, more or less, right? But maybe done differently with some sort of mechanisms around how you're actually producing in this game with some uncertainty of what the inputs that make you produce are, maybe thinking through what other people are trying to do or something. And I could see that working maybe, but you might need some other end. That would be a means to sort of have a score that is more certain in its outcome.
And I think that's because this mechanism has like an inherent swinginess to it,
Yeah.
right? Like the whole point of this means there's like big differences between hitting the sweet spot and missing it even by a little bit, right? And that could feel really frustrating. I think it's also a mechanic that can frustrate players, can lead to bad vibes if we almost performed exactly the same except for we were like one value off from each other, and and I've succeeded gloriously and you've failed miserably.
Yeah.
That's how the fox in the forest is, right?
Yeah.
You've won, you missed the sweet spot of 9 tricks by 1 and hit 10, and now you get nothing and I get everything.
Yep. It can be very frustrating. Sort of the arcade game that we talked about where you try to stop it. I didn't play it a lot because missing and getting nothing or maybe a couple tickets, really frustrating. Sort of feel like you've wasted a quarter, right? Or even going back and,
It's probably like $1.50 today.
yeah. Oh my gosh. That'd be horrible. Put in $10 with a chance to win 1,000. Yeah, yeah. I video games I think have a lot of these examples where you can get into a state of it being frustrating. So some sweet spot mechanisms that we talked about, or sort of golf games where we're trying to stop it perfectly, whiffing in one of those games can feel bad. Gears of War is a game that I played a little bit when I was
It's
much
funny that
younger,
it's funny that you just talk about like the golf video
like in
game.
real life.
Like real life golf is the same, right? Like you
No,
swing, yeah, 100%, dude. Like I,
sure.
I mean,
The
right? Like
feedback is less immediate, though, right?
no, what like you're just doing the same thing, but with your actual like kinetic energy. You're
I I guess
swinging the club. If you
okay.
swing it like too hard and wildly out of control, you're gonna get a poor result right away.
I
You
hear
know,
you, but if I hit it perfectly, I don't get fire on my ball launching across the screen, right? Like
you
in
get
Mario
something
Golf.
even better, like internal like glow,
Okay,
like validation. I don't play ball golf as we disc
sure.
golfers call it.
Ball
Golfers
golf.
golfers hate that. I play disc golf, but like
Oh my
there
gosh.
you get that like fire feeling where you're just like,
Yeah.
oh my god, I just threw that so far with like so little effort. Did you guys
Mm,
see what just happened there? And
yeah.
people are like, yeah, try and do it again. It's like,
Check
well,
my fire.
I can't.
Yeah,
That
that's
was
awesome.
it totally like yes, you don't get like a glowing exclamation point like pops up over your head, but it feels just the same, I think. Perhaps even more real in the actual world than in the video game version.
Yeah. I've played a lot of fighting games, and I know you have played a fair amount or a lot too, Jake. And there's this sort of style of move that are used in a lot of fighting games. I know that in Tekken, they're in Pokken Tournament, a game I played a ton of called Just Frames, where you want to hit a button and then hit a follow up button at exactly the right time. It's basically the Mario Golf mechanism, except you don't have a meter. You just have to
Just
know
like way
roughly when
more
in the
try
animation.
hardy than that.
Yeah. You have to know when in the animation you have to hit it again. And I will say, I have seen many times players playing in tournament where they're used to being able to hit this sweet spot. They'll miss it and just spiral because missing it feels so bad, right? You get in your own head. And I can say the flip side is I recently went back and played Pokken after not playing it for a really long time and hit a sweet spot on a move with a character that I like to play, Lucario. First time trying after years of not playing it. And it felt incredible. It was like one of the best sweet spots. I was like, I am so good at this game, right? Like, that's not really, but it felt that way just in the
Yeah.
moment because you have the, yeah. It's cool. I like the feedback that sweet spot mechanisms can provide, right? If efficiency games are good at fairness, sweet spot mechanisms are good at feedback and
Yeah,
excitement.
and I think that leads me to sort of like a conclusion or a thought. Conclusion feels way too strong, where this works best in games that offer like quick iterative rounds, like in
Yep.
Crokinole, right? I'm gonna just flick these
Flick.
pucks. We're
Yep.
going around the table. You're gonna get 24 tries to flick your puck to try and land it in the circle. Oh, I hit it a little too hard that time. I'm trying to do a little too soft. Oh, that was a little too soft, right? I'm trying to very specifically figure out how to like use the kinetic energy of my finger flicking this thing just right.
Yep.
You were going to mention something about Gears of War. I just want to give you the chance to say it in case there's like somebody's like, oh, I can't wait to hear Brendan's thoughts on Gears
Oh,
of
have you
War.
ever
Yeah, I
played that
cut you
game?
off. Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about, like the active reload, right?
Yeah, so this game, it has this mechanism where if you need to reload your weapon, it gives you the bar like in Mario Golf, and if you stop it at the exact right time, you get a bonus. If you miss it, you get a penalty. So it's basically that mechanism, but like you're saying, Jake, it just takes a sweet spot mechanism and it makes it the small part of the game itself, and it's not make or break. If you miss, it's not like you lose all this progress, but it's just enough of a benefit that it feels good to aim for, and I think there's a spectrum here, right? Where if you have a sweet spot mechanism where the arcade game, where if you hit it in the middle, you get this massive jackpot and then you're done for the day because you get 50,000 tickets. That's like at one end of the spectrum. And the other end is just this example where maybe in one game, you're going to do this 20 times. And the goal, like where you want to be, is getting it right 20 times. So I think that's the same type of mechanism used in two really different ways. And I think they can both work to different benefit. The
Right.
jackpot mechanism, it gives your game this like climactic arc or climactic moment for everyone to look at. And on the other side, you're
You
raising
lose or you win.
you
Let's
win.
find out right now.
Exactly. But then on the other side, it's sort of like it gives you this little goal to shoot for every time, and it kind of makes the sweet spotting itself a mechanism through iteration. And I think that feels fun and neat too. And because it's a novel way of raising the skill ceiling in this game of something that normally in other games is just a single button press. So it
Yeah.
literally creates an area for you to increase your skill that it didn't exist before. It makes it more interactive, gives you something new to think about or
And
to
in
get good
Gears
at.
of War, right, if you miss out on it, you like jam your gun, right? The
Yeah,
animation is like the
exactly.
person's it just takes you longer.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Which
That's the noise
yeah,
they
that
make.
that
Yeah,
is
yeah.
interesting. I'm trying to think of board game examples that use it in like a softer touch of
Yeah.
just like right, that would almost be like, a track that's like 9, 10, 9, 8, right?
Sure.
8, 9, 10, 9, 8. It's like, yeah, you definitely want to get 10, but 8, 9, not that far off of 10
Yeah.
versus like, and I think that would still definitely be a sweet spot
Yeah.
versus what we're more considering it of like, have been thinking a lot in this episode of this track as being like negative, 0, 0, 0, negative 3, 10, negative 3,
Yeah. Totally.
or whatever.
Okay, here's another example, and maybe then we can pivot to closing, even though you're already kind of did that for yourself with the conclusion, which I appreciate. And I'm sorry for messing up our flow, but bowling.
No, no. That
Does
was a
bowling
straight
have
conclusion.
Does bowling have a sweet spot mechanism? So let's think about this, right? The goal is to knock down all the pins in one throw.
Strike.
So to get a strike, you hit the sweet spot and you knock down all the pins. The benefit of this is that you get the number of points for your next throw counted double, right? You get it counted on the next frame and then you add it to the frame before. If it's a strike, you get the next two. If you get a spare, you get the next one. And then also at the end of the game, you could potentially, if you sweet spot, get extra turns. I think it kind of does, but not as cleanly as some of the examples we said. And the
Yeah.
downside being you could just not get as many turns as someone else, right?
I think it isn't a sweet spot. I mean, like to me, in bowling, the sweet spot is putting the ball in the lane, not too far left, not too far right, not too much spin, not too little spin, not too fast, not too low. And the result of hitting that sweet spot is a strike,
Yeah.
more so than it applies to scoring, where it falls down a bit because you can't. If there were 11 pins out there and a
Mm.
strike was hitting 10 and hitting 11 was
Oh,
not a spare or something, then that would feel more like a sweet spot.
I think that's a great example of how sweet spot mechanisms have to be careful too, though. Whereas I think bowling as designed is more fulfilling. Like I just can't imagine a game in which of bowling that you structured where there are 11 pins out and the goal
Yeah.
is to just leave one up. It's so much less
Well,
exciting,
I think
even if
that
you
we have the distinction here between the bullseye,
in
or
darts.
sorry, the sweet spot and the jackpot, right? Bowling
Yeah,
is you've got this jackpot mechanic going on that is
interesting.
related to, but not exactly a sweet spot mechanic.
Well, I will say, as sort of my concluding thought, because thank you for humoring me about bowling, is just that I think that this has made me realize how much room there is to potentially kind of explore this space in maybe going to sort of tried and true scoring. If that's not working in a design, trying to think through just doing the mental exercise of, will a sweet spot add more dramatic arc to my game? Is there a way to work a sweet spot into some aspect of my game that's going to raise the skill ceiling for players? More isn't always more. In some games, more is okay because maybe you're getting your dramatic moments elsewhere. But if more is more isn't leading to some sort of compelling moment that's drawing people in, maybe more isn't more for your game right now, and you need a sweet spot mechanism to give players room to test their agency within the core loop of that game.
And my final thought is this: I love playing sports, and I think I love them because of the sweet spot mechanic
Mm,
more than anything else, right? Sports do such an elegant job of rewarding you when you operate like smoothly and kinetically and efficiently all at once in order to get the best result at what you're trying to do. And often the exact wrong way to go about it is to do whatever you're trying to achieve. Kick the soccer ball at the goal with all of your might. You're
yeah,
supposed, you want to take a little bit off so that you have like more control over what you're trying to do, right?
kick
You're
it just
rare,
right. Yep,
yeah. You're rarely, there are spaces in sports, of course, where you're using power, right? I'm going to run as fast as I can to this spot on the field and beat you there. But
yep.
so much more often, we're trying to, do a little less than that, be a little bit more efficient out there. And I love that so much. And I think that that feeling of like not, of swinging the bat at 90% power, uh, shooting the ball at 90%, power, jumping, whatever, right? Is something that feels missing in a lot of games, which seem to do a really good job at like the efficiency aspect, right? I'm running a race, I'm trying to conserve my energy. I'm just gonna mix every sports metaphor at once in this final thought, right? I'm running the race, I'm trying to conserve my energy so that I have zero energy left at the end. I've used it all up, but not before the last moment. Like that
Yeah.
is all over board games. And I think so too is like I'm running as fast as I can. I'm pushing as hard as I can, right? You find that all over games as well, but a lot less of this like sweet spot, which is really like where dexterity games live. So I think there is totally room to explore that more in the board game space, and maybe we'll do it. Maybe other designers are already out there, but it's just something that excites me to see how much room there is for board games and design to grow over the years to come.
And if that excites you, we'd love to hear from you. Come talk about this episode, the concept of sweet spots and the Goldilocks zone with us in our Discord. You can find a link to it in our show notes. If you've never heard of Discord, it's just like a chat room in your browser or on your phone where you can be in conversation with other decision space listeners and with Jake and I about this very episode. So you can also find a link to that if you'd like on our website, decisionspacepodcast.com, where you can find a link to this episode, our show notes, and all the other episodes of Decision Space and our Patreon. If you like what we're doing, help us do more of it by supporting us with some small amount monetarily every month for cool bonuses like a video version of this podcast early, typically just for listeners, unedited. Show notes when we have them, then we add them to our Discord for folks to see. And, who knows what else more. But yeah, until next time, thank you to Hembry for our intro and outro song, Reach Out.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.